She was just the maid, until the rich cowboy came home one night and found her singing to his daughter. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that draped itself over the sprawling ranch like a heavy blanket. In the main house, where tall windows looked out over endless acres of land, a soft voice drifted through the halls. It wasn't the echo of wind, nor the hum of crickets outside, but the tender melody of a woman singing. Her voice carried warmth, unpolished yet sincere, and it wrapped itself around the heart of the child who clung to her. She had come into this home with no grand introduction, only the simple title of maid. Her days were filled with polishing wooden floors, mending clothes, and keeping order in a house where silence often pressed down harder than work. No one paid her much mind. She was just there, always moving in the background, unseen but indispensable. Yet in the quiet hours, when her work was done, she allowed herself one freedom: she would sing. The child, too often left alone in the big house, had once stumbled upon her humming. From then on, it became their secret ritual, the maid and the little girl tucked in the nursery, songs soft enough to soothe restless dreams. That night, the man of the house returned earlier than expected. A cowboy, hardened by years of ranch life, his presence carried the weight of dust, leather, and silence. He had been away tending to cattle and contracts, his boots carving miles into dry land, his heart still shackled by a loss he rarely spoke of. The death of his wife had carved a hollowness into him that no wealth nor work could fill. He provided for his daughter with all his strength, yet he could not provide the one thing she craved most: the gentle, nurturing presence of a mother. When he stepped inside the house, expecting the usual stillness, he paused. A voice, rich with feeling, drifted down the hallway. He followed it, each step cautious, as though afraid to break the spell. The door to his daughter's room was ajar, and through it, he saw a sight that rooted him to the floor. The maid, her hair loose around her shoulders, sat beside the little girl's bed. She was singing softly, the kind of song that didn't need instruments to feel whole, her hand brushing through the child's hair as the girl's eyelids fluttered, finally surrendering to sleep. For the first time in months, he saw his daughter at peace. Not restless, not begging for attention, but secure in the presence of another. His chest tightened, not with anger at the maid for overstepping, but with something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He realized then that his daughter had found comfort where he himself had failed to give it. The maid looked up, startled when she caught his gaze. Her face flushed, and she stumbled over her words, whispering apologies, explaining that she only wanted to help the child sleep. He should have dismissed her, reminded her of her place in the house, but the words never came. Instead, he asked her to continue, his voice low, almost hesitant. She obeyed, her voice trembling at first, but soon the melody filled the room again. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, not as a master of the house, but as a man who hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear a song until that moment. In the days that followed, he found himself listening for her voice, waiting for those stolen moments when she would sing. He began noticing details he had overlooked before: the way she moved quietly, the tenderness with which she cared for his daughter, the patience that seemed to radiate from her presence. She was not just a maid. She was something more, something that breathed life back into the spaces grief had long emptied. The girl began clinging to her more openly, asking for her during meals, reaching for her hand when she felt afraid. The cowboy watched, torn between gratitude and a strange unease. His heart was stirring, awakening in ways he hadn't thought possible. She was just the maid, yes, but every note she sang, every smile she offered, every quiet sacrifice she made, was unraveling the walls he had built around himself. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and painted the ranch in gold, he found her outside, her hands still stained from work, her eyes lifted to the sky as though she carried a secret prayer. He asked her, not as an employer, but as a man desperate to understand, why she sang. She told him she sang because it was the only way she knew to heal wounds, her own and others. Life had been cruel to her too, but in music she found strength, and in offering it, she found purpose. His silence lingered, heavy and thoughtful, before he finally admitted the truth. Her voice had not only soothed his daughter, it had touched him as well. He confessed that her presence had begun to fill the empty spaces in his home, in his heart. The words left him vulnerable, stripped of the armor he wore so well. She looked at him with wide eyes, torn between disbelief and the quiet ache of her own hidden feelings. The maid had never imagined a place for herself beyond service, never dreamed that someone like him could look at her as more. Yet here he was, a man who had lost so much, slowly learning to love again, and it was her voice, her presence, that had led him back to that possibility. The days grew into nights where the silence was no longer unbearable. The cowboy found himself lingering in the house more often, no longer seeking refuge in endless work. He listened when she sang, he watched when she smiled, and he felt a bond tightening not only between her and his daughter but between himself and her. It was not sudden, nor reckless. It was patient, built with the same strength that kept the ranch alive. She had been just the maid, unseen and uncelebrated. But now, through the eyes of a child and the heart of a grieving man, she became something far greater, the melody that turned a lonely house back into a home. The ranch stretched out endlessly under the sky, its fences running in straight lines that looked as though they had been etched by a tired hand across the horizon. The days were long here, filled with the sounds of cattle, the grind of work, and the whispers of dust as the wind moved over the land. Nights, however, were heavy with silence. The big house in the center of the property seemed to carry that silence like a burden. Every room held echoes of what used to be, laughter that no longer rang, footsteps that no longer came, warmth that had vanished with the passing of one woman who had once filled the place with life. She had not been part of that life, not in the beginning. She came later, a woman with no claim to the land, no name that carried weight, no past that she dared to speak of openly. She arrived with a single bundle of belongings, dressed plainly, her eyes cast downward as she was introduced simply as the maid. Her duties were straightforward: keep the house in order, tend to the cleaning, cook when needed, make herself useful, and ask for nothing in return. She accepted her role quietly. She rose with the sun, moved like a shadow through the rooms, polished the wooden floors until they gleamed, scrubbed clothes until her knuckles burned, and carried the endless weight of chores with silent resolve. She did not ask to be noticed. She expected no kindness. Life had taught her that being invisible was safer than being seen. But within her chest, hidden from the world, she carried a gift. A voice. It was not the kind polished singers displayed on stages, not something trained or sharpened by masters of music, but it was hers, honest, warm, and filled with the ache and beauty of survival. She sang only when alone, when she believed no ears were near. Singing, for her, was not entertainment, it was healing. It was how she soothed her own scars, how she remembered her mother's arms, how she reminded herself that there was more to life than labor and silence. One night, that secret spilled into the open. The little girl, restless and weary from dreams that left her trembling, slipped quietly from her bed. Her father, the master of the house, was gone again, out on the land, tending to work that seemed never ending. The child wandered the hallway, her small feet brushing against the rug as she searched for comfort. That was when she heard it, a melody, soft and strange, floating from the kitchen. Drawn like a moth to a flame, she followed. There, bathed in the light of a single lantern, stood the maid. Her sleeves rolled up, her hands busy with dishes, but her voice filled the air like something alive. The girl froze in the doorway, listening, her eyes wide. It was the first sound in months that didn't feel heavy, the first thing that lifted the weight in her small chest. The maid turned suddenly, startled to see her. A plate nearly slipped from her hand. "Oh," she gasped, her face flushing. "I didn't know you were awake." The little girl only stared, then whispered, "Sing again." The maid hesitated. No one had ever asked that of her. But something in the child's eyes, something raw and pleading, broke her resistance. She nodded, drying her hands, and began again, this time softer, slower. The girl edged closer, leaning against the counter, her eyes half closing as the melody wrapped around her. That night, for the first time since her mother's death, the child fell asleep peacefully, cradled not in arms but in song. From then on, it became their secret ritual. At bedtime, the maid would sit at the edge of the little girl's bed and sing. Sometimes lullabies, sometimes old folk tunes she remembered from her own childhood, sometimes melodies she made up on the spot. The child would curl against her side, listening with all the devotion of one starved for comfort. And in those moments, the maid felt something stir inside her, a tenderness she had long buried. The cowboy knew nothing of this at first. His world was the land, the cattle, the endless business of survival. He rose before dawn, his boots crunching over frost, his shoulders bent with the weight of responsibility. He returned after sunset, his face drawn, his voice rough. Since his wife's death, he had carried grief like a brand pressed into his skin. He did not speak of it, did not share it. He poured himself into work, into keeping the ranch alive, into making sure his daughter never lacked for food or clothing. But love, affection, gentleness, these were things he did not know how to give anymore. Then one evening, the silence of the house betrayed him. He returned earlier than usual, dust clinging to his boots, the smell of leather and horses clinging to his clothes. He stepped inside, expecting emptiness. But from down the hallway came a sound he had not heard in years. A voice, soft, melodic, trembling with a beauty that rooted him in place. He followed, his brow furrowed, each step measured, until he reached the doorway of his daughter's room. The sight stopped him cold. There she was, the maid, sitting by the bed, her hand resting gently on his daughter's hair as she sang. The child's eyes fluttered, heavy with sleep, her lips curved in a smile he had not seen in so long. The cowboy stood in the shadows, watching as the song wrapped around them both like a blanket. The maid looked up suddenly and froze. Her voice faltered, her cheeks flushed. I only meant to help her sleep," she whispered, her tone apologetic, almost fearful. He should have rebuked her. He should have reminded her of her place, told her this was not her duty. But the words never came. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, and said quietly, "Keep going." She blinked at him, uncertain, but the look in his eyes was not harsh. Slowly, hesitantly, she continued. Her voice trembled at first, but then steadied, filling the room again. He listened, his chest tightening, his jaw set as though holding back something deep. The melody touched something in him that had been locked away, something he had forgotten, the sound of peace. When the song ended, and his daughter's breathing evened into sleep, the maid rose quickly, smoothing her apron, trying to slip past him. But his voice stopped her. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" She paused, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I didn't learn. It's just something I do. It helps." His brow furrowed, but he said nothing more. He let her pass, yet the echo of her voice clung to him long after she was gone. In the days that followed, he began to notice what he had been blind to before. His daughter's laughter, brighter now, filling corners of the house that had long been empty. Her insistence on the maid's presence, the way she reached for her hand, the way she clung to her apron when frightened. And always, every night, the songs. The cowboy found himself lingering near the doorway, listening unseen, torn between gratitude and unease. The maid, meanwhile, struggled with the boundaries she had drawn for herself. She reminded herself daily that she was just a servant, nothing more. But each time the little girl's arms wrapped around her neck, Each time the cowboy's gaze lingered longer than it should, her heart whispered otherwise. She had known loneliness, had tasted abandonment. And now, here, she felt something dangerous, like belonging. One evening, as the sun burned low and the sky turned crimson, he found her outside by the well. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hands raw from scrubbing, her hair falling loose. She did not notice him at first, too lost in her thoughts. "You sing every night," he said finally. She startled, turning quickly, her eyes wide. "Only because it helps her. She needs it." He stepped closer, his face unreadable. "She does. But it's more than that. Your voice brings something into this house that's been missing for a long time." Her heart thudded hard against her ribs. She lowered her eyes, whispering, "I didn't mean to overstep." "You didn't," he said softly, almost as though admitting it to himself. The silence that followed was charged, fragile, filled with words neither dared to speak. And in that silence, something began to change. The ranch was not a place where secrets stayed hidden for long. The wide open land, the thin walls of the big house, the steady rhythm of work, all of it seemed to uncover what people tried hardest to keep tucked away. But the maid carried her secret carefully, like a fragile bundle she dared not drop. She had lived too many lives in silence, too many nights in places where her worth was reduced to labor and obedience. Here, she told herself, was no different. She was just the maid. And yet, it was different. Because of the child, because of the man who kept watching her with eyes that spoke more than his lips would ever allow. The little girl had begun to depend on her completely. At meals, she refused to eat unless the maid sat nearby. At bedtime, she would not close her eyes unless the maid sang. In moments of fear, she clung to the maid's apron, calling for her instead of her father. It should have troubled the cowboy, should have stirred jealousy or even anger, but instead it forced him to face a truth he had long buried. His grief had left him incapable of giving his daughter what she needed most. And somehow, the maid, this quiet woman who came to them with nothing, had given it freely. He told himself to be cautious. He told himself not to feel what he was beginning to feel. But the heart rarely obeys the mind. He found excuses to linger in the house instead of riding out at dawn. He noticed the way the sun lit her hair when she passed by a window, the way her voice rose and fell like something alive. He caught himself listening for her footsteps, for the sound of her humming in the kitchen, for the soft laugh she sometimes let slip when the little girl said something innocent. The maid noticed, too. She felt his presence more often, felt the weight of his eyes when she worked. It unsettled her, not because she feared him, but because she feared herself. She had come here to survive, not to dream. Dreams had cost her dearly before. Still, each time he spoke to her, not as a master, but as a man, her resolve weakened. One night, after the girl had fallen asleep to the sound of her song, she slipped outside to the porch, craving the cool air. She thought she was alone, but he was already there, leaning against the post, the glow of his pipe faint in the dark. "You calm her," he said without looking at her. "Better than I ever could." She folded her hands, uncertain. "She only needs gentleness. Any voice would do." "No," he said firmly, turning toward her. "Not any voice. Yours." The words struck her like a blow and a gift all at once. She looked down, her throat tightening. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because I am no one," she whispered. "Because I am just the maid." His silence stretched out, heavy and thoughtful. Then he said, "You are not just anything." The days after that grew more complicated. The maid tried to avoid him, burying herself in work, keeping her eyes on the ground. But the little girl would not allow distance. She pulled them together again and again, insisting her father listen when the maid sang, demanding they all eat together, holding both their hands at once as if she already understood what neither adult would admit. Still, the maid carried her secret. She had known poverty that left her hungry for days. She had known betrayal that carved scars across her heart. And she had known love once, brief and bright, before it had been ripped away. That past was not something she could offer a man like him. She feared what would happen if he knew. But fate has a way of pulling truth into the light. It happened on a stormy night, when thunder rolled across the sky and lightning split the horizon. The girl had run to the maid's room, trembling with fear. The maid gathered her close, rocking her gently, singing louder than usual to drown the storm. The cowboy entered suddenly, his boots heavy on the floor, his face drawn with concern. He saw his daughter nestled in the maid's arms and stopped short, his breath catching. The maid looked up, fear flashing in her eyes, not fear of him, but of what he might see. For in that moment, she was not a servant. She was a mother. Every note of her song, every touch of her hand, radiated love she had not meant to reveal. He crossed the room slowly, his voice low. She is more at peace with you than she has ever been with me. She only misses what she has lost, the maid whispered. His jaw tightened. And what about you? What have you lost? Her lips parted, but no words came. The truth pressed against her chest, desperate to escape, but years of silence held it back. He watched her, waiting, his eyes demanding honesty. Finally, trembling, she spoke. I lost everything, she admitted. A family, a place to belong. I came here because I had nowhere else left to go. I thought if I worked hard enough, I could disappear. But your daughter, she won't let me disappear. The cowboy's gaze softened, though his voice remained steady. Neither will I. The words cut through her defenses like a blade through cloth. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the hardened rancher, not the grieving widower, but a man standing as bare and wounded as she was. And in that moment, something shifted between them, something no storm could wash away. After that night, the walls they had built around themselves began to crumble. It was not sudden, not reckless, but slow and steady, like the thaw of winter into spring. The cowboy began to speak more, not just about work but about life, about the wife he had lost, about the loneliness that had eaten at him. The maid, in turn, shared pieces of her past, hesitant, fragile truths about the hardships that had shaped her. Each confession was a step closer, each silence filled not with emptiness but with understanding. The little girl, sensing the change, blossomed. Her laughter grew louder, her steps lighter. She no longer feared nights, for the house was no longer silent. Music drifted through the halls, not just songs but the sound of voices, of conversation, of hope returning. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky with gold, the cowboy found the maid in the garden, humming softly as she gathered herbs. He stood watching her for a long time before speaking. You've given me back my daughter, he said. You've given me back more than I thought I could ever have. She shook her head, her hands trembling. I've only done what anyone would. No, he said, stepping closer. Not anyone. You. Her eyes met his, wide and uncertain. And what am I to you? He did not hesitate. You are the woman who turned my house back into a home. The words broke something inside her, broke it and healed it at once. Tears welled in her eyes, and she turned away, afraid of what they meant. But he reached out, gently, not as a master claiming what was his, but as a man offering what was left of his heart. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of quiet, not the silence of emptiness, but the peace of belonging. The maid no longer felt like a shadow moving through the house. She was part of its rhythm, part of its life. The little girl clung to her openly now, calling her name without hesitation. And the cowboy, though he spoke little, showed in every glance, every gesture, what his words had already confessed. She had come here as no one, carrying nothing but a voice. She had been just the maid. But in the arms of a child and in the eyes of a man who had forgotten how to hope, she had become something more. She had become the song that healed them all. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now. Watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in the way you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.